The lawyer slid the folder across the table and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Harrington. The sale is complete." I looked down at the number on the final settlement sheet. $2.4 million. After 31 years of running a small but steady plumbing supply business in Burlington, Ontario, it was done. I shook hands with the buyers, walked out into the February cold, and sat in my truck for a long time without starting the engine. I was 63 years old. My wife, Margaret, had passed 2 years earlier from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while she was making oatmeal. The business had been something to hold on to after that, but my knees were giving out. My accountant kept telling me I should think about succession, and when a regional distribution company made me a serious offer, I finally said yes. My son Daniel called me that evening. He had driven up from Toronto with his wife Sandra, and they took me to dinner at a steakhouse on Lakeshore to celebrate. I remember thinking how good it felt to sit across from my son, to watch him order a bottle of wine and make a toast to his mother's memory. I thought, this is what it was all for. Daniel was 34. He worked in commercial real estate, dressed well, spoke confidently. Sandra was quieter. She taught elementary school and always seemed a little out of place when Daniel talked about money, which he did often. I had never quite understood what she saw in him or what he saw in her, but they had been married 6 years and seemed stable enough. Over dinner, Daniel brought up the subject of investment. He said he had a colleague, a financial advisor named Trevor, who worked with high-net-worth individuals and had a strong track record with real estate income trusts. He said Trevor had helped several of his clients turn mid-sized windfalls into substantial retirement portfolios. He said the timing was good, interest rates were shifting, and that if I moved quickly, I could lock in at a favorable position. I listened. I nodded. I told him I would think about it. I want to be honest here. I did not immediately feel suspicious. Daniel had always been ambitious, sometimes impractical, but I had no reason to believe he was anything other than a son who wanted his father to be financially comfortable. I told myself that. Over the following weeks, he called more than he had in the previous year. He sent me links to articles about retirement planning. He dropped by the house twice, something he had not done in months. Each time he brought Trevor up. Each time he framed it as urgency. The window is closing, the fund is nearly subscribed. Trevor can only take on 1 or 2 more clients at this level. I told him I had scheduled a meeting with my own financial advisor, a woman named Carol at a TD branch in Burlington, who had helped Margaret and me manage our RRSPs for 15 years. Daniel made a face when I said that. He said Carol was fine for modest savings, but that this was a different league. He said it gently, but the implication was clear. My instincts were too small for the money I now had. I did not say anything. But something shifted in me that afternoon. The meeting with Carol took place on a Wednesday morning. She was careful and methodical as always, asked about my timeline, my risk tolerance, my monthly expenses. When I described what Daniel had told me about Trevor and the income trust, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Before you go anywhere near something like that, can you get me the fund's registration number?" I told her I would ask Daniel. She said, "If there's any hesitation on that question, please come back to me before you sign anything." There was hesitation. When I texted Daniel asking for the registration number, he replied 20 minutes later saying he would have Trevor send over a full package. The package arrived 2 days later by email. It was polished, professional looking, full of graphs and projections. Carol looked at it and called me the same afternoon. She said the fund was not registered with the Ontario Securities Commission. She said the address listed for the company corresponded to a virtual office suite in Mississauga. She said she had seen this structure before. I sat with that for 3 days before I said anything to Daniel. I want you to understand what those 3 days felt like. Margaret was gone. Daniel was my only child. I had memories of teaching him to skate on the rink behind the community center on New Year's Day, of driving him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning, of sitting in the hospital waiting room when Sandra had a miscarriage 2 years into their marriage. I had given him everything I had that was not the business, and now the business was money, and someone was trying to take it. The question I could not stop asking myself was, how much did Daniel know? I called my brother-in-law Robert, who was a retired RCMP officer and Margaret's younger brother. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do not tell Daniel what you know. Not yet. Let me make some calls." Robert came back to me the next day. He had spoken to a contact who still worked financial crimes. The contact said the structure Daniel had described: a high-return fund, push-through personal referral, pressure around timing, professional-looking documentation from an unregistered entity, was consistent with an affinity fraud model that had been cycling through southern Ontario for about 18 months. Several victims in the Halton region had already filed complaints. The amounts lost ranged from $400,000 to over $1 million. I drove to Daniel's house on a Saturday morning. I did not call ahead. Sandra answered the door. She looked at me, and I could see something move across her face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of wariness, like she had been waiting for this without knowing it. She said Daniel was still asleep. I said I would wait. She made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a while neither of us spoke. Then she said very quietly, "How much did he ask you to move?" I looked at her. I said, "You know about this." She put her mug down. Her hands were shaking slightly. She said, "I found out 3 weeks ago. He told me Trevor was helping him with a personal investment, and then I saw an email. He had left his laptop open, and I realized it wasn't just an investment. Daniel has a debt, a gambling debt. He owes Trevor's associate a significant amount of money. The plan was—" She stopped. She looked out the window toward the backyard. Then she said, "The plan was that if he could bring Trevor a client at your level, the debt would be cleared." I did not say anything. I drank my coffee. My hands were steady. I did not know how. Daniel came downstairs 20 minutes later in a t-shirt and sweatpants, and when he saw me sitting at his kitchen table with Sandra, the color left his face. He said, "Dad, I didn't know you were coming." I told him to sit down. He tried at first to keep up the pretense. He said Trevor was legitimate. The fund was in a category that didn't require the same registration as a public offering. He had been trying to help me. I let him talk. When he finished, I placed a printed copy of Carol's notes on the table and Robert's summary of the OSC complaint file, and I watched my son read them. He did not cry. He got very still. He said, "I didn't know it would go this far." I told him I had not transferred any money. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer. I told him that Trevor's real name was not Trevor, that he had 2 prior fraud convictions in Alberta, and that the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit was already aware of the operation. Then I asked him the question I had been carrying for 8 days. I said, "Did you know that I could lose everything? Did you sit across from me at that steakhouse and already know what you were planning to do?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "The debt was $40,000. I was scared. $40,000. My son had been willing to send his 63-year-old father into a fraudulent investment to cover $40,000 in gambling losses. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she had worried about Daniel quietly for years, his spending, his overconfidence, his need to seem successful, and how she had never wanted to say it out loud. I stood up. I told Daniel I needed time. I told him that I would not be pressing charges against him personally because there was no evidence he had committed a crime beyond making an introduction and allowing himself to be complicit. But I told him that if he had any further contact with Trevor or his associates, or if he ever again attempted to involve me in anything financial without full transparency, we would be done. Not just as father and son doing business together. Done. Sandra walked me to my truck. She said, "I'm sorry. I should have called you the moment I found out." I told her I didn't blame her. She had been living in that house with the weight of it. I told her to look after herself. I drove back to Burlington on the QEW, and I cried for part of the drive. The kind of crying that is not about one thing, but about everything. About Margaret. About the years I had spent building something I had hoped would mean security for the people I loved. About the gap between the son I had raised and the man sitting in that kitchen. I cried, and then I stopped, and I turned on the radio and listened to the rest of the drive. In the weeks that followed, Robert connected me with a detective in Hamilton who was building the case against the network Trevor operated in. I gave a full statement. I provided all the documentation Daniel had sent me. I was told my cooperation was valuable because, unlike most victims, I had come in before any money moved. The detective said that was uncommon. He said most people transfer before they talk to anyone, because the people running these operations are very good at creating pressure and isolation. I thought about that word, isolation. Daniel had, whether consciously or not, been steering me away from Carol, away from the people who would have asked the right questions. That was part of the method. Carol helped me set up a proper retirement portfolio through a regulated firm, mostly GICs, a balanced mutual fund, a small amount in dividend equities. Nothing exciting. Sustainable. I put a portion aside in a TFSA for travel and kept enough liquid for home maintenance and emergencies. It is not a complicated plan. It does not require a Trevor. My relationship with Daniel has been one of the hardest things I have navigated in the 2 years since. We did not speak for 4 months. He entered a program for gambling addiction through CAMH in Toronto, which Sandra told me about by text. I did not respond right away. I needed to figure out what I actually felt before I said anything, because I had spent too long in my life saying the thing that seemed right, rather than the thing that was true. What I felt was grief, mostly. Not anger, grief, for the version of this that should have happened. The father and son sitting across a table. The son saying, "I have a problem." The father saying, "Let me help you find a way through it." That version did not happen. Instead, there was a steakhouse and a bottle of wine and a setup that required my ruin to complete itself. I called Daniel in the fall. We talked for about 40 minutes. He was different, quieter, less polished. He said he had been working with a counselor and that one of the things they kept coming back to was the moment he decided not to tell me the truth about the debt. He said he thought I would be disappointed. He said he thought I would look at him the way I looked at people who weren't careful with things. I told him that I had made my own mistakes. I told him about a period in my late 30s when the business was failing, and I had taken out a second mortgage without telling Margaret and carried that secret for 8 months. I had never told him that before. He was quiet for a while after I said it. We are not back to where we were. I am not sure we ever will be, but we talk now, and the talking is more honest than it has been in years, possibly more honest than it has ever been. There is something in that worth holding on to. Sandra filed for divorce in March. I learned this from Daniel, who told me without self-pity, which I appreciated. He is renting an apartment near the program in Toronto. He is attending meetings. He called me on my birthday, and we talked for an hour about a hockey game and about the fact that I am learning to cook properly for the first time in my life. And it was the most ordinary conversation we have had in years, and I was grateful for it. I do not tell this story to hold anyone in contempt. I tell it because I think there are people who will recognize something in it. The particular blindness that comes from wanting to believe the best of someone you love. The way money has a way of exposing everything that was already fragile. The morning after the sale closed, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the lawyer's office, and I thought about all the years I had gotten up early and driven to work and tried to build something honest. I thought I was building it for my family. I still believe I was, but the money was never the point. I know that now in a way I did not fully know before. What saved me was not cleverness. It was a woman named Carol who asked one simple question, and a brother-in-law who still had the phone numbers worth calling, and a wife's daughter-in-law sitting at a kitchen table who had been carrying something too heavy alone for 3 weeks and finally put it down. I am 65 now. I live in the same house Margaret and I shared for 22 years. The backyard needs work. I've been meaning to plant something in the corner where the old fence post rotted out. I think I will plant something this spring. I have thought a great deal about the sequence of events that brought me to that kitchen table in my son's house, sitting across from a woman who had been carrying a secret that was not hers to carry. And what I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened was sudden. Every moment had something before it, and every choice had a consequence that arrived eventually, whether or not anyone was watching. Daniel did not become someone willing to use his father overnight. That willingness had been growing quietly for years in the space between what he wanted to appear to be and what he had actually become. The gambling, the debt, the decision to stay silent rather than ask for help. Each of those choices made the next one easier, until the final step, the one that involved me, seemed almost logical to him. That is how it works. We do not usually arrive at our worst moments in one leap. We get there gradually, through a long series of small concessions to fear and pride. And I was not without my own part in it. I had built something I was proud of, and somewhere along the way, I had let that pride become a kind of wall between my son and me. He thought he could not come to me with $40,000 in gambling debt, because he thought I would look at him as someone who had failed to be careful. He was probably right about that. I had spent 31 years being careful, and I had not always been patient with people who weren't. That is something I have had to sit with honestly. What I learned from all of this is that wisdom is not the same as experience. I had decades of experience running a business, managing money, making decisions under pressure. But wisdom requires something more. It requires the willingness to ask the right questions before you need to build the kinds of relationships where truth can be spoken without consequence. I had not done that with my son. Carol, my financial advisor, asked one honest question, and it changed everything. Robert, my brother-in-law, made 3 phone calls and saved my retirement. Sandra, a woman I had never fully understood, told me the truth at a kitchen table because she could not carry it anymore. The people who protected me were the ones I had invested in quietly and consistently over years, not the ones I had tried to impress. There is something in that worth understanding. The relationships that hold when things go wrong are rarely the spectacular ones. They are the ordinary ones. The advisor you have seen twice a year for 15 years, the brother-in-law you call when you do not know what else to do, the daughter-in-law who makes you coffee and finally says what needs to be said. Those connections do not happen by accident. They are built through small acts of reliability and honesty, repeated over time. I am not a perfect father. I was not a perfect husband. But I am still here, and I am still learning, and I think that counts for something. If you are reading this and you have money coming in from a sale, an inheritance, a settlement, anything, please talk to someone you trust before you talk to anyone who stands to benefit. And if you have a son or a daughter or anyone you love who is struggling, make it easier for them to tell you the truth than to hide it. That is the thing I would go back and change. Not the business, not the sale, just that.